Madam Chair and members of the committee, this is a very serious piece of legislation and a very important piece of legislation. The idea that we would delay this until some time that the Secretary of Labor could make some certification about its impact on food costs is really unacceptable. Let's look at the record of the Secretary of Labor. Since January 1980 until 2006, there were 281 explosions in these kinds of facilities due to dust. 718 people were injured and 119 died in those explosions. 119 breadwinners were killed in those explosions. At that time, that's a result of a study from the Chemical Safety Board, of whose members are all appointed by President George W. Bush, an independent agency that may be the gold standard in terms of independent review of accidents. They then recommended that OSHA adopt dust standards. OSHA did nothing. No enforceable standards were adopted by that point. No enforceable standards at all. And then in February in 2008, the Imperial Sugar Plant exploded. In the meantime, 67 explosions took place since the Chemical Safety Board recommended the standard. 75 injuries and 14 deaths took place before OSHA did anything. And the Chemical Safety Board recommendations continue to say no enforceable standards with respect to dust. Not only does it devastate these lives of these individuals and their families in the community, it devastates the facility. A facility here that is key to the commerce of that area. So talk about an impact on price in a tight market when these facilities start pumping up. The feed and grain people, they're under their own standard. And what is their analysis of that standard? That it drove technologies, it drove better design, better productivity in their markets. That's their finding. They're not implicated in these standards. What happened there? 8 people were killed in the explosion. 20 were put into medically induced comas for a number of weeks. 5 of those died, and 3 are still in the hospital. Since the Chemical Safety Board made its recommendation, there have been 67 explosions, and OSHA never found the urgency to protect these workers. Now to come along and be so cynical as to suggest that if we could just keep killing the workers, the price of food will stay down. You know, it's funny. I read the papers, read the Business Journal, reading the Wall Street Journal, and they're talking about how the price of food has driven the profits of the grain companies. But when they talk about why it's going up, it says the crisis stems from a combination of heightened demand of food from fast-growing developing countries like China and India, low grain stockpiles caused by bad weather and prices, increasing amounts of land used to grow crops for ethanol and others. Some people say it's because in Zimbabwe has quit producing food under the corrupt regime of Mr. Mugabe, so Africa has a double problem. I see that the governor of Texas, Mr. Rick Perry, thinks that we ought to cut back on ethanol production. He doesn't think we ought to keep killing American workers. Nowhere in this paper, Wall Street Journal, mind you, nowhere in this paper you read about food prices. Do you see any mention that we ought to continue to subsidize food prices by blowing up processing plants and killing and injuring workers? Nowhere do you see that except perhaps in this amendment. We ought not to accept this amendment. These workers in this critical industry are entitled to this protection. And the facts on the ground are the last time we put in a standard was for the feed and grain industry, and it's turned out to be wildly successful. Why is it wildly successful? Because injuries went down 40%. Fatalities went down 60%. Explosions went down 60%. Don't you think we know enough now to think that these other workers in this industry are entitled to this protection? But OSHA has done nothing. OSHA has done nothing. And if OSHA is not going to act, we must. In this administration, OSHA has only acted when prodded by the courts or the Congress. Never on their own. Never on their own have they suggested that they were going to go out and do this, even after the recommendation of a presidentially appointed commission to look at these kinds of accidents. appointed by this president, they've chosen to do nothing. And it's important. It's important to these workers. It's important to the commerce. John Barrow and I have put together legislation that works for the industry. We've consulted with the industry. We've sat down with the industry. We've sat down with OSHA, and we ought to oppose this motion to recommit. In the name of the workers, in the name of their families, in the name of our nation, we owe it to protect these workers.
All time for debate has expired.